The ideas and information explored in this webinar are featured in When Your Child Learns Differently by Dr. Kathryn Fishman-Weaver, available from proofrock.com.
Now, let me introduce Kathryn Fishman-Weaver. She is the Director of Academic Affairs at Mizzou Academy. So basically, this is originally was the laboratory school through the University of Missouri. And it is now a school that encompasses blended learning, online learning, runs elementary through grade 12. And Kathryn's essentially I mean, if we're talking about old terms, she's the principal there, and she'll talk a little bit about that school, because I think maybe we can learn some lessons about online learning from what they're doing, because they're doing a lot of outreach to schools. In addition to the kids that they're working with, they're also working with schools to help them with the online learning challenges. She coordinates courses on culturally responsive teaching and service learning for pre-service teachers there at the University of Missouri. She was 11 years a special education and gifted education teacher in both California and Missouri. And she's the author of three books by Proofrock Press. Well, it's by Kathryn, but we published the 3 books. The first is a wonderful book, award-winning book, Wholehearted Teaching of Gifted Young Women, and then Brain-Based Learning with Gifted Students. That's just coming out this season, and When Your Child Learns Differently, which is the topic of conversation today. So thank you, Kathryn. Thank you for doing this webinar with us.
Oh, thanks so much. It's exciting to be here.
So the origin of this book is an interesting one. It essentially started with a Facebook post. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's exactly the origin story. So I had a close friend in college. We'll call her Anne. This is, before social media. We were very close. And then we graduated, and we didn't have all these ways to stay in touch. So when social media was a thing that happened, we reconnected, but only superficially, to notice each other's getting married and the births of our children and adoptions of our children, but hadn't really connected. And one night I went downstairs and my husband had said, "Hey, did you see Anne's post?" And I said, "No, what's going on?" He said, "You should check it out." And so I got on Facebook, and my dear friend from college posted this incredibly raw, vulnerable post about how she and her partner were navigating special education services with their son. He was just school age, and so they were starting to navigate what those services looked like, what the IEP process was, and she was having all of these really difficult emotions, and it was really a call for help. And so, I hadn't talked to her in maybe a decade. And I reached out. I still had her number in my phone, and I reached out and just said, I'm here. I've been there. I've experienced this. Can I be of any help? And we talked for a really long time. We got off the phone, and my husband was nearby, and he kind of heard my side of the conversation. And he said, "My goodness," he said, "there's nothing out there to help families navigate." And I said, "Oh, surely there is." And so, I went on all the different booksellers, and I was looking for a specific kind of book that spoke about hope and knowledge, that was affirming, but also practical. And my husband was right. I couldn't find anything that was exactly the tone I wanted. And so he said, "Well, then you've got to write it." And so I did, and Anne got to read with me kind of throughout the process.
No, that's a wonderful story. I tell you what, let me do this. I'm going to throw up here real quickly the table of contents from the book, if I can find where I pulled that up, right here. So the reason I wanted to pull this up is that I thought that one of the advantages that this book offers is that if you ever go into like the parenting section, special needs parenting section of a Barnes & Noble, and look at the books that are out there, they are voluminous, they're thick, they're very focused on legal advocacy and getting you up to speed with what your rights are and that sort of thing, which are important. I don't want to dismiss that, but boy, can that be overwhelming when you're first, diving into this topic. And so I wanted to bring this table of contents up just to show folks that we're talking about, the first starting off with this idea of navigating services, with hope and knowledge. And I'm going to ask you to talk about that in a little bit. Advocating with love. So there's an advocacy piece in here. There's operationalizing high expectations for your child. And that was going to be one of the early questions I have, is how do we set high expectations in given everything else going on? And then giving yourself a little grace, which I think all of us deserve these days. But let me start off with this idea of love and high expectations. Can you talk about what you mean by that, and what you were thinking in that piece?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go ahead and I'll pull up something too to share with you all that was important in my writing of the book. We can share this quote certainly, but then I want to go to the next slide. That in our world, there's all this pressure to be whatever normal means. And I think probably all of us on this webinar, and certainly in the work that Proofrock does, approach this idea from a different perspective of let's celebrate exceptionality instead of all of this pressure to be like everyone else. And so what I want to share is this image that Joel put up earlier, and it's on the cover of the book. And I want to share where this came from, because this is where I learned about teaching and parenting with love and high expectations. So this image, this is a mural painted by my first group ever of students in Oakland, California. So my very first job as a teacher was to start a special education program for students with moderate disabilities in grades 1 through 3. So most of the students in my class had graduated out of a kindergarten classroom that was for students with more profound disabilities, and they were moving into what would be a less restrictive environment. The school where I was teaching had never served that population before, and I was young and new and naive and knew nothing. And so here I am, a brand new teacher, and I come from a non-traditional background, so I didn't study in a college of ed. And so my only schema for what a first grade teacher was my first grade teacher. And I had a great first grade teacher. Her name's Betty Crawford. And she made me a stronger reader and writer. And we solved complicated math problems together. And so I said, that's what a first grade teacher does. That's what I'm going to do too. And so that's what we set out to do. We read a lot and we wrote a lot. And I believed that if kids had access to literacy-rich environments and folks who believed in them, that everything would kind of work out okay. The school district where I was teaching at the time was undergoing some pretty radical reimagining of what special education services look like. They had been centralized before, and now they were dispersed across the district. A product of that was that the individualized education plans for each of my students, so their IEPs, arrived very late. I didn't get them until 6-7 weeks into the school year. Looking back, I'm grateful for that. So when the IEPs arrived and I read them, I couldn't believe it. I checked on multiple occasions to see, were these documents written about the kids that I was reading with and writing with and that I loved so much? Because I read in these documents, so-and-so will never learn how to read. And I would look up and here we were reading sight words, or so-and-so would never learn how to communicate effectively. And here was so-and-so navigating a game on the carpet. And it doesn't always work like that, but it did in kind of my birth of becoming a teacher, and it's marked my whole pedagogy about how we teach kids. So this project, this mural, was one of our first mainstream projects. So it was very important to me right away that my students were included in the broader school population. And so I made really lifelong friends with the general education first grade teachers. And we taught in pretty radically innovative ways in terms of sharing kids and dividing rosters. And the 3 classes got together and we painted this large mural that you can still see if you visit East Oakland. And so that was sort of a tether or a reminder for me throughout the writing of the book and where this idea of love and high expectations comes from.
You know, Kathryn, and as I recall, I looked up that school at one point, and it's like one of the reasons that mural is absent any white kids is that there are hardly any white kids in that school, and it is a very poor school. I mean, the obstacles that those kids were facing were pretty large. Was that true back then when you were teaching there?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and in my college work with pre-service teachers, I talk a lot about my experience learning how to be a teacher at that school, and the socio-political context that was at play, that in many ways in the first few months, at least in the classroom, I was painfully naive to. So, you know, I shared that my school had never served the population of students who receive IEP services, who are in kind of the moderate end of the disability continuum. But another factor was my students were bused in. So this is a small neighborhood school. And you're right, you know, all of our students receive free and reduced lunch. Most of the student population spoke Spanish at home. We had lots of recent immigrants in our school. My students were bused in, some of them from other neighborhoods. And so there is this whole context at play around space and place and inclusion. Our classroom, there was never a space kind of set up as the self-contained classroom. And so we were creative with space, which, I mean, those on this webinar who teacher parent for students who receive IEP services know that often learning specialists are asked to be very creative with space. So we had what was a lovely space, but it wasn't intended necessarily to be a classroom. Upstairs, it's a K-8 building. My kids remember our first graders when we start out, and our space is in the 8th grade wing. And so 8th graders are huge. And my students, you know, like, we're sharing a bathroom with the 8th graders. And so all of this navigating, how do we build relationships? How do we engage in intercultural understanding really shaped me into the educator that I strive to be.
That makes a great deal of sense. So, I mean, in a sense, the transitional thinking is, hey, you were learning the system then, and as a parent with a child who's exceptional, one of the first things you talk about in your book is navigating services with knowledge and knowledge and hope. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and what is that concept within the book?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is some of kind of what I was looking for too. And in the book I couldn't find for my friend. I've got an image from the book, so I'll pull that up for you all. So I really wanted a book that was anchored by this idea of hope, and we can call it by other names, and knowledge, and we can also call that by other names. So if you think of parenting, and I think this translates to teaching also, as a journey, and we think about being on this journey with young people who we care deeply for, I wanted to think about, you know, what do you need to get through this journey together? And I think, you know, kind of the two anchors that you need are knowledge and hope. And so knowledge, we talked about a little bit. There are a lot of processes and policies and how do the services work and all of this paperwork and procedural rights and safeguards. When you kind of enter as a parent into this special education space, it's overwhelming. It's like reading this acronym soup. So you need some knowledge of what are my rights as a family member, as a guardian, as a parent, what's reasonable to expect in terms of services. When I go into an IEP meeting, like what are the things that are going to happen? And often no one tells you this, right? Like you go and you experience it, and that experience can pull up lots of huge emotions, like we talked about with my friend, because there's no one there to really prep you. And then the other piece that you need that is just as important or more important, and what I found was missing in some of the other literature as I was looking for books to recommend, is this idea of hope, right? This idea that a positive solution or outcome will happen, that we're committed to these kids that we love, that the challenge, the concept, is worth fighting for, right? This work matters. In fact, there's no work that's more important. And then this idea that by working together, positive change is possible. And so throughout the book, and you saw this a little bit even, I think, in the table of contents, like these are the anchors of, if I'm going to sit down and have the conversation with my friend, and I really wanted the readers to feel that kind of closeness. Like these are the two guideposts as we talk about the journey together.
Yeah, because in that first chapter, you talk, your first section, you talk about education policy and the IEP overview. You do a nice job of holding hands as parents are walking through this process. Could I ask you, because I know, as gifted education, one of the things that we've crossed over into is twice exceptional learners and kids with dual labels, and also even outside of that, I'll tell you, all the boys in my family had dyslexia in either greater or lesser degree, and my second oldest brother refers to the school that he went to in second grade as Miss Nell's School for Dummies. Like he just, like, this was a blight experience for the older brothers. My mother, eventually, she'd had 2 years of college. She went back to school, got her undergraduate degree, her master's, and her doctorate in special education on this pursuit of how to help her kids with this challenge. And I was fortunate enough to come a little later. Mom was, I think, 36 when I was born, so she'd already gotten to the point where she learned what needed to be done, and early intervention was great for my experiences. But it is I guess for families, it is such a you don't fall into easy boxes sometimes. Sometimes you can have a kid who's really bright, but also has dyslexia or has ADHD. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that kids can present themselves in the school. Does your book address the idea of twice exceptionalities and other gifted populations?
It does. So there's a section on there on kind of special populations within this already special population, where we talk about twice exceptional learners. We also talk about students who are English learners. Navigating special services for that population can also be really challenging as we look at home language and second language acquisition or third language acquisition. So I know you shared kind of when you introduced me that I've worked both in gifted education settings and then also as a learning specialist. And so as I think about those groups, and I'll share, when I was a learning specialist first, and then I became a gifted education teacher later in my career. When I first started as a gifted education teacher, I thought of those as distinct populations, right? I thought I'm now working with a new population at the beginning. And I learned very quickly that was a misnomer for lots of reasons, right? So if we think about students as being diagnosed as gifted, if we think about neurodiversity as a whole range of gifts and talents, which we also talk about in the book. But also if we think about this kind of the quote from the beginning of in the world, there's a lot of pressure to be normal, whatever that means. And oftentimes students who don't fit the profile of normal, whatever that means, are separated from their peers. And we see this, I saw this in my career, both with our gifted and advanced students, and also with our students who receive IEP and special services. And then we have students who fit all of those boxes. But I saw, kind of in my first year in gifted education, my students in that population, with very few exceptions, had limited access, exposure, friendships with students who received IEP services. It was like this other population, they were in the same physical building, and these two groups didn't ever get to interact. And so I did a lot of work kind of from a theoretical standpoint around like border crossing or critical moral geography, like how can we disrupt this separation or segregation that we're seeing in schools. And so when I was working at the high school level, we did a lot of joint projects between, at the time we called it a community skills class, and then my gifted education advisory, where we would work together to write books, to have literacy events, to play games. And every time the reciprocity of learning that happened across those relationships was astounding, and just reminded me how unhealthy it is to separate students on the basis of any identity. So kind of as we're thinking about navigating difference and disability and ability, I think that's got to be a big part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it puts you as a parent in a role of being able to see what your kid is capable of, and then what the expectations are in the school. And I wanted to get, and the reason I jumped there was I in back referencing in the earlier part of our discussion, I was talking about Dewey Rossetti's book. She was a parent who had to start advocating for her special needs child, and it became a lifelong career. Essentially, she started a network of parents, and advocacy is a tremendously important part of what we're doing as parents when we have special needs kids. Can you talk a little bit about your thinking about advocacy and some of the principles of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to pull something back up here for us. So I talk about in the book this idea of what does it mean to advocate with love? And I really wanted to ground this in kind of, if we think back to that idea of hope or love or belonging to each other. So yes, all of that knowledge and all the policy matters, but also I want to get at kind of the purpose, the heart of what it is we're doing. So when we advocate for love with our children who receive special services, we're looking for ways to say things like, I see you. And I've thought a lot about during this pandemic, actually, about just the value of being seen, of being heard, right? Of being truly present with another person, that I will keep you safe. So as we're talking about, we talked a little bit about the socio-political context of education. Safety is a real factor for us to think through. I value your perspective, and I know we'll talk some more about this in our conversation too. This idea that our children for whom we're advocating have the most important perspective in this whole thing, right? And so often, too often, I think that their perspective is missing from the conversation. So I really wanted to center the perspective of young people, that we believe in our children, that we're cheering for them, we're on their side, that we're committed to inclusion, including when we have to disrupt really set boundaries in school systems or in other social groups, that our children matter to us, how powerful. I mean, there's so much social emotional learning research on this idea of mattering and belonging and the importance of children hearing this and seeing this and experiencing this in lots of different ways, and that we're in this journey together. And so while I go into the procedural rights and safeguards and what's going to happen in the IEP, I wanted kind of to use that term again, that the anchor of how we think about advocacy to be a little different maybe than what folks had read before.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's probably one of the hardest things for parents, is that once you start having to advocate, you're essentially having to put yourself out there and go in and be a strong advocate for your child. And man, that can feel uncomfortable, especially when you have the strength of this institution hanging over you. So it's good that you've got a section in there that encourages parents in that way. But that leads me to the idea that this is a civil right. Special education is a civil right. Can you talk about that? Like that, this is something that you should be demanding, because it is your right to do so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we talked a little bit about this idea that I think all of us in this conversation share, that separating or segregating children on the basis of any identity is unhealthy, that it runs counter to the democratic ideals of U.S. public education. If we look at kind of the civil rights story of special education, it mirrors and runs not only in parallel, but also in cooperation with many of the other civil rights struggles that we've experienced in the United States. So if we kind of look at Brown v. Board as a catalyst for families beginning to advocate in new ways for inclusion, we see this in how special education policy was written too, right? So Brown v. Board is an important beginning for the special education advocacy journey too. And then if we look at kind of major legislation that followed, it follows in the 60s, in the 70s. It's then reauthorized in 1990, which goodness doesn't feel that long ago. So, I mean, we're celebrating the 30th anniversary this year of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I think what's really important, and I know there are a lot of families on this call, is to remember that family and parent advocacy was the driving force behind expanding civil rights for children with disabilities. And again, I think we see this kind of across our civil rights struggles, is the driving voice is so often that voice of the family, the voice that's advocating for love, and then kind of the other stakeholders come along later. So that voice of family is powerful.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let me pause for a second and encourage those of you who are in attendance to open up that Q&A box and start asking questions. I mean, we're forced because the webinar is one format. A book allows you to get into the details of a thing. We're sort of like we're looking at the broader 30,000 foot or 10,000 foot view of this topic. But if you've got some micro level questions, some specific things that you want to talk about, please use that Q&A box and we'll make sure that we get to those questions. Kathryn, talk a little bit. I know this wasn't part of our discussions earlier, but once I realized the expansiveness of the Mizzou Academy's online and blended learning capabilities, what are parents faced with right now with online and blended learning? And do you have any lessons from the experience at the Mizzou Academy you could talk a bit?
Absolutely. So my goodness, I am just sending so much strength and encouragement and grace to families right now as we're navigating either online learning or in-person learning that looks very different, or hybrid learning, or whatever that reality might be. And I'm also extending kind of that same strength and encouragement and grace to teachers who also have never navigated a global pandemic before while teaching reading development. So I think one of my first big takeaways is that it helps to name a thing and to say, this is really hard and we've never done it before. And that runs in parallel with some of what I write about in the book too, which is often, I've never raised a child who receives IEP services before, and this is really hard, and I don't yet know what I'm doing. And I'm committed to doing the best possible job that I can, and sometimes I don't feel like I have all the tools to do that. So we're certainly seeing this in teaching during a pandemic. What we found at Mizzou Academy, so we serve, I'm doing some math right now. We're serving, including districts that are licensing our elementary curriculum, close to 9,000 students annually across all 50 states and 60 plus countries through online and blended solutions. So we've got this tremendous community, and also, if you want to look at it as a researcher data set of kind of what's working and also where's the room to improve. What we find is a lot of what we know works in in-person learning are the same things that matter online as well. So we know that relationships are the heart of great teaching. We know that kids need educators and families who believe in them and who hold them to high expectations. And I've been having a lot of conversations with educators lately around what do high expectations look like in this environment. And I think approaching that with maybe some unprecedented flexibility is really important. So in a lot of our populations, we're seeing that high expectations always means critical thinking, right? Right now, and maybe always, it also means connecting on lots of different levels. So connecting to self, connecting to current events, connecting across communities. I've been resonating a lot this week on what we're going to run a conference on the transformative power of connection. Like, what are the lessons we've learned in 2020 about how student communities have to connect in order to learn? How is connection related to learning kind of on a cognitive level, but also on the social emotional learning level? And so I've been encouraging teachers and families to take a big breath, to think about what are your anchors, and we want the anchors to be young people in relationships, and then high expectations, and then to remember, just like we tell our kids, that at the end of the day, the best you can do every day is the best you can do, and then we're going to wake up tomorrow and we're going to do our best again, and to give each other that grace has been really important.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, we're going to run out of time and have to move over to the Q&A section, but that grace piece, that's the last piece of your book. And maybe that's a good way to can you discuss a little bit about the grace that's not just part of the COVID, but part of like raising a child and working with the school system when you've got a special needs kid?
Absolutely. So writing this book was a pretty powerful learning experience for me. So I had a lot of, I had some good friends who have raised children with disabilities or are continuing to, who kind of partnered with me as a friend on this project. They reviewed chapters, they gave me feedback. And one of the things that we talked about kind of across this sort of thought group that was right along with me in the project was how alone we felt during the process, and how many kind of raw, big emotions we had that had gone unprocessed. So in the writing of this book and in the conceptualizing of this book, kind of this thought group and I were processing what we'd been through and how we wished, you know, if you had it to do again, and that's kind of a dangerous thing, but if we had it to do again, we would have given ourselves more grace. We would have remembered to center community. We would have tried to remember to take good care of ourselves, right? So like you take good care of others by also taking care of yourself. And again, like, this is a message that I wish someone had sat down with me and said, Kathryn, yes, this is really hard. It's also the most important thing, and you can do it, and you're not alone. So when I think about giving grace, that's what I think about.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna do a little bit of advertising here and let people see your books. Those of you who are interested in Kathryn's book, let me take you to the Proofrock Press website real quickly here, and or not so quickly. Let me pull this slide up. Oh, I know what I did. I pulled up Kathryn's slides. So there we go. Sorry, I had the wrong tab open. So this is Kathryn's page. If you come to the Proofrock Press website and just type in Weaver in the search engine, you'll get all of her books coming up. This is her author page. She has 3 fantastic books. One is a study that was focused on talented, gifted young women and the things that worked and were successful with those kids, and also the obstacles that we put in their place. And it's a fantastic book. She's got a new book out, Brain-Based Learning with gifted students, and then the one that we are talking about now, When Your Child Learns Differently. All that's available from proofrock.com. I invite you to go over to our website and take a look at that. So now we've got some questions in the box that Stephanie's going to take over and handle the Q&A section. I wanted to address one, and then I'd be interested in what you say, what your thoughts are, Kathryn. But the one on acceleration. So we've got a gifted teacher lurking in here that was talking about essentially acceleration is a strategy that has a huge body of research that supports its use, and it is like. Well, the questioner didn't say this, but this is my view of this: is it is the least used strategy in schools. It's like we were putting together this basically research-based practices that actually have a wide body of research to support their use, and the number one strategy is acceleration, and we can show achievement gains by accelerating kids. And essentially, when you think about it, and this comes back to, this is not a book that we published, but it's a guy that I'm a fan of, is Dr. Todd Rose from Harvard. The idea that with acceleration means that kids who need more time with a piece can have that more time so that they can be successful with it. And kids who can move on quickly can move on quickly. Everybody can be successful with content if we can have a variable rate of learning. I know that's not necessarily easy, but I know that that does work. And I was just talking with a parent the other day that their kid is working in mathematics 4 grade levels ahead of where they are now, and they wanted to accelerate their child just within the elementary school, and it wasn't going to happen. The principal absolutely said that's not a policy that we have. It's just tremendous frustration. So I understand where you're coming from, Sheila. That's the questioner, and it's one that we struggle with. It is it's frustrating. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, absolutely, tons. So one, when you asked, about our work at Mizzou Academy, so something that the online forum provides us is this platform for accelerated opportunities for learners. So we frequently, in our online kind of self-paced courses, have gifted students, advanced students who are working many grade levels beyond their age level peers, and they experience great success, right? For all of the reasons that you mentioned. And then I think just kind of to tether this to the conversation about students with disabilities or students who receive IEP services, I think it's also important to remember that acceleration is often for that group too, right? So disability is a piece of an identity that may impact some of the things that you do or don't do, but it's not a child's whole identity. So when we think about operationalizing high expectations, really playing in the talent domain of our kids is so important. So not to discount acceleration for any population.
100%. Thank you for clarifying that. Okay, I just wanted to jump in on that one. Stephanie, please feel free to take over now. Thanks.
Yeah, sure thing. So our first question here, how is inclusion addressed when a student needs a small class size and general ed is only large class sizes?
Yeah. And I think that this comes back to some of the tension we were just talking about with acceleration, which is that so often schools structure things in a very specific kind of unchanging way that maybe works well for a majority population, maybe. And schools as organizations are typically slow to change. So kind of my guidance on this would be, let's think flexibly about the school day. Let's think about where are our opportunities for small group and also large group as we think about inclusion, and as we think about least restrictive environment, and also as we think about needs. A day is long. Within a school day, there should be lots of opportunities for all of these different kinds of engagement. The challenge, I know, often comes back to the master schedule, to things like space. I think these are surmountable. And one of my big hopes kind of from 2020, so schools as organizations are typically very slow to change. Well, in March 2020, we were not slow to change. We had no choice but to change. And I'm hoping that we emerge from this with some new tools in our toolkits, including thinking divergently and flexibly about how we use space and place in the school building so that inclusion in small groups and whole group and in different ways could be even more possible.
Great. I hope so.
Yeah.
Our next question is kind of a specific one, but I think it might be helpful to others. This person says, my son has an IEP and is currently learning virtually. He's in pre-K and will be returning to school in a couple weeks. Half-day sessions will not accommodate the number of minutes written in his IEP. So how should this person approach this with the school?
Yeah, absolutely. And so in March of 2020, when we moved to all virtual instruction, as a special education community across the US, that's kind of the proverbial we, policymakers and special education teachers went back to IDEA and to other legislative documents to see what kind of guidance could they give. And the answer is, well, not much, because they weren't written with a pandemic in mind. And so some really important conversations started happening around compensatory services. How are we going to address kind of gaps in services, learning that happened in different ways over the past several months. And so my guidance would be to set up an IEP meeting as soon as possible, kind of when the school building reopens. My hope is that a case manager would reach out about doing that soon anyhow, but if not, kind of part of that advocacy to look at, we want the service minutes to reflect accurately, in the IEP, and want to have a really frank conversation about how your son is going to get everything that he needs, knowing that resources are finite and that we're in unprecedented times, but you'll need facts to work with. And so I'm sending you lots of encouragement, but I also would recommend having that meeting sooner rather than later, so that you know what all you have to work with going forward.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, on the other side of things, our middle school students, we had someone asking about supporting AIG children. I think that's academically and intellectually gifted in middle school. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I love middle school. I love sixth grade in particular. These students are so much fun.
I hated it. I taught it 1 year and it almost killed me. And then I moved to the high school. So God love you.
Middle school is actually my only time as a student when I didn't like school. And so maybe that's why I'm so partial to it now. I want kids to have a different experience, but oh yeah, I do. I just love middle school kids. Not knowing a whole lot about your context, I would encourage you to pursue some accelerated options for your child right now while virtual learning is still so pervasive. I really do believe that virtual learning is and I'm hopeful, is going to continue to open doorways for accelerated options. I'm a huge advocate for public schools, so I would encourage you to start first with your public school district. But I echo a lot of what Joel said too. I know that there are sometimes district policies in place kind of against acceleration. And in those cases, if you come up against that wall, then I'd encourage you to maybe look to private or to other options, even if just for one course, right? So oftentimes, there is that thing that lights our kids up, or there is that thing that they're really ready for some more advanced learning in. Sometimes it's academic content, sometimes it's not. So I would encourage that too. It could be music, it could be a language, it could be something in the arts, it could be something in athletics, but to find an opportunity for advanced or accelerated study for your middle school student. And maybe the virtual landscape opens different doors than we had 6 months ago.
Yeah, and I promise, because that person came in and posted. I allowed anonymous questions this time because I didn't know if we were going to get to some sensitive questions. So she came in and anonymously asked that question. That was not me as a setup for this, but this season we did release the 3rd edition of Educating Gifted Students in Middle School, a practical guide, and this is really a series of best practices, and it's designed in terms of everything that was designed for. It was a practitioner's book. It's not a research. I mean, it is research based and it cites all the research, but this is designed for a practitioner in the school. So if you'll pop over to proofrock.com, we have a book for you. So feel free to do so. Sorry, Stephanie, I just jumped out.
No, that was perfect. I had to plug in my headphones. So.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So our next question. So this person has a 4th grade daughter who qualifies as a 504 learner, but also has a high IQ. So she was asking for some practical tips on how to keep her encouraged because she's kind of in that gray area.
Yeah. Oh, I feel this. I also have a 4th grade daughter who has a very similar profile. I find, and I'm one of my commitments in the book was to be candid and frank and honest and transparent and vulnerable, even when it's hard. So I want to be sure that I'm, because I have a 4th grade daughter who fits a very similar profile, that I'm being honest with you. What I find is that, in my own story, the 4th grader who I know and love dearly is very able to articulate to me what is working and what is not working. Sometimes, in her valid perspective, there's a whole lot not working, and we have to do a lot of digging to get at the what is working, what strategy is going to be successful. So I would encourage you to let the child be a strong driver in this conversation. So to validate their perspective and also kind of to commit to. So it's fine to kind of go through, here are all the reasons why that's not working. We can learn some things from there. But in a conversation, I often will kind of set a goal that says, we're not going to finish this conversation until we come up with together an action step, something that is working, something productive that we can do next, something that we can try. And so by really being co-partners in navigating education, we're able to kind of move forward.
Great. Yeah, our next question, are there key indicators that it would be better for an exceptional learner to move out of public school and into another option? When do you think that would be a good thing to consider?
Yeah, it's a great question. In the book, I have a section on kind of key questions to consider if you're looking into private schools and how, what to look for to see if this might be a good environment for your child. So I think that we are very fortunate as a country to have different options for schooling. I know kind of deep in my soul, and also you've heard enough about my career now to know that children learn differently, that the way we've always done things doesn't work for all kids. In fact, it doesn't work for a lot of kids. I also, am a relentless optimist. So believe in the power of teams that are student-centered to think differently about existing school structures, whether that's public or private. So when we center kids' thoughts and bring a team around a table and share that we all are here for the same purpose, and that is what's best for the child. I believe I've seen in my own practice how we can radically reimagine what happens. I think about kind of those projects I did with the students in my gifted advisory class and the students in the community skills class. Nothing like that had ever been done before. I also think that sometimes we reach a point where change is the best way forward. And sometimes that change is a dramatic change. Sometimes it is a different school. I would say that families know that best, know when we have exhausted this conversation and it's time, at least temporarily, to try something new. And I think that's important to remember too, maybe we need a different solution for middle school, and then maybe we can come back to our district solution in high school. And so to think about educational environment as being transient.
Yeah, I had a dear, and boy, this all has to do with if you have the the privilege and the opportunity to do some of those things. I did have a dear friend of mine that their special needs kid was here in the Austin, Texas area, not in Austin ISD, but in one of the suburban school districts. And it was just a struggle every day working with that school. And she got a job opportunity up in Minnesota, and the family moved up to Minnesota, and they got into a wonderful school district. And she was telling me this story, and we were at a conference. She was telling me the story, and she just broke down in tears. That it was just a life-changing experience to get out of that place and move into a nurturing and supportive school district. So you're sometimes it is time for a change. Stephanie, we one more question, please, and then we'll have to close it out.
Sure thing. All right, this last question. When a student's IEP and FBA are glaringly incorrect, what options do you have to provide the services they need?
Yeah, so that's kind of what I experienced in my first year in the classroom, right? So I was working with these students, and thank goodness that I received these documents late, and I found them to be so inaccurate in some cases that I didn't think they were written about the kids in my class. So this happens. And it's unfortunate and wrong. There is recourse. So again, I would start by asking for an IEP meeting. At that IEP meeting, I would encourage you to advocate with love in the ways we've talked about in this webinar, because your child's education is the most important thing being discussed in this meeting, and your child deserves and is entitled to a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment possible that works and meets your child's needs. So I would encourage that meeting with kind of clear steps of this is what's working, this is what's not working. I'm a big fan of child-led or child co-led IEP meetings. If your child's voice can be a part of that meeting, it can be so powerful. And then we try and move forward together. So we start there. And if that doesn't work, then there's kind of a system to escalate. And some of that recourse is also talked about in the book.
Oh, thank you, Kathryn. Let me do everybody a bit of a favor here. Let me give everyone your contact information. These are ways that you can reach out to Kathryn if you have some questions after the webinar, if you just like to connect with Kathryn. Also, I can't leave this up for too long, so if you could just take a screenshot of it real quickly, and then you could use this information later. It is also available on that author page on the Proofrock Press website, so you can also go there and get this information as well. So first, I want to conclude by thanking everyone who showed up today. I know that we are all under a great deal. I've got little kids at home. You guys are teachers or parents at home. Like, we are all under a lot of stress these days, and we're juggling a lot of balls and have a lot of plates in the air, if I can mix all those metaphors together. So thank you so much for coming and taking time to visit with us live today. I will be sending out a link to the recording for those of you to share with others, and I will also send out a certificate of attendance in a couple of days. So just give me a couple of days for that. Stephanie McCauley, I'd like to thank you for being here in our Austin, Texas quote office. we're all working from home now. And Kathryn Fishman-Weaver, I so appreciate you coming and doing this and talking about this. It's such a wonderful book, and it's such an important topic, and your time is so valuable. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for including me.
All right, everybody, thanks again, and we will see you at the next webinar. Bye-bye.